The sea, once a barrier between continents and the world's peoples, later a pathway to unknown lands. By the late 15th century, European navigators were traveling far and wide, bringing European trade, economic systems, and colonization to distant lands. This is the age of discovery. In our program, we have two subject matter experts. Teofilo Ruiz, Professor of History, University of California, Los Angeles.
Bartolomeu Diaz is one of the pioneers in this sailing down the coast of Africa and then making the turn, the Cape of Good Hope.
Jeffrey Simcox, Professor of History, University of California, Los Angeles.
Columbus, when he sets out in 1492, wants to establish trading relations with China and makes a contract with the Spanish crown for a cut of the proceeds. So, yes, financial motives are not to be discounted at all.
Before the Renaissance, before this rebirth of curiosity about our planet, the peoples of the world were isolated, geographically and economically. And then, explorers like Columbus emerged and paved the way for a revolution in knowledge about the world and its inhabitants. Exploration, while it exploded on a world scale during the Age of Discovery, had its beginnings centuries earlier. The ancient Romans, Greeks, and Phoenicians were fearless mariners and explored the lands near their homes.
The Phoenicians really traveled throughout the Mediterranean and established colonies throughout the Mediterranean coast in Africa, in Iberia, in Italy, and so on, in Sicily. So the Phoenicians were great travelers and traders in the context of the Mediterranean world.
A great contribution was made to world geography by Ptolemy of Alexandria in the 2nd century. He gathered information from many early sources, from traders, mariners, and adventurers, and created a map of the then known world.
The geography gave Europeans their basic idea of how the globe of the world was arranged. And if you look at maps arranged according to Ptolemy's system, you have a huge Eurasian continent which extends for about 180 degrees around the world's circumference, from China to the British Isles and Iceland. And that's attached to Africa. So you have this huge landmass and then nothing the other side of it. Now, this is very important for Columbus, obviously, because Columbus, following Ptolemy's system of his description of the world, believed all you had to do was sail across this ocean from Spain or Portugal, and you would eventually hit China.
Egyptians and Babylonians also ventured out to sea, and they left us maps of their view of the world, which are essentially maps of their own regions.
In classical antiquity, probably the Phoenicians and the Carthaginians were the most daring of seafarers and explorers, and supposedly a Phoenician expedition did circumnavigate Africa, we are told. How believable this is, of course, a matter of scholarly debate.
The most ambitious and far-reaching explorations of the post-classical period were the Norse voyages of the Vikings in the 9th and 10th centuries. Without leaving us maps of their journeys, they did leave some written accounts of their adventures. The voyages of Eric the Red and Leif Erikson took them from Scandinavia south to the British Isles, along the coast of France and Spain to the Mediterranean, north and west to Iceland, Greenland, and south to Labrador, Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, and probably America. as far south as Massachusetts.
I think that the evidence is pretty convincing that the Vikings or the Norsemen were the first ones to really reach the New World. That is besides the natives who came 30,000 years ago through the Strait of Bering Straits.
Further exploration of these lands would have to wait another 4 centuries. While westward exploration would come much later, the lands to the east bore an irresistible attraction. The travels of Marco Polo are among the most important. At the young age of 17, Marco Polo, along with his father and uncle, set out from their home in Venice in the year 1271 on a journey that would take them 24 years.
Marco Polo, first of all, I think we have to define him not as an explorer. He wasn't an explorer, he was a merchant. And he went to China with his father and his uncle, as everybody knows, I think, as a merchant, also on a diplomatic mission for the Pope, who was hoping to convert the Mongol leadership to Christianity.
But the importance of Marco Polo in the European imaginary is the description of the wonders of the East and of the wealth of the East, which will become a further incentive later on for a whole generation of travelers and discoverers and so on, who will be motivated by the image that Marco Polo has painted of the world beyond.
It's particularly important because this was one of Columbus's favorite books. And it is from Marco Polo's description of the great rich empire of China that Columbus is inspired to sail westwards in search of it. So Marco Polo is very important as one of the major influences on Columbus's voyages.
In the early 15th century, the Chinese emperor launched a series of expeditions.
The purpose of these expeditions was not really exploration. The Chinese had a pretty good idea of the geography of Southeast Asia and India. It was more a series of voyages to establish the diplomatic influence of the Chinese empire.
The ships the Chinese used were huge, capable of carrying hundreds of men.
The Niña, the Pinta, the Santa Maria, the famous 3 boats, essentially, that Columbus used to come across the Atlantic, would have fit amply into one of the great Chinese junks that were trading and moving along the Indian Ocean, and which could reach Africa and so on.
And the Chinese fleets were immense.
There is a fleet of as many as 300 ships that sails from China on the way to East Africa. Then they are called back by the emperor in China, and essentially China withdraw behind the Great Wall.
These voyages were enormously expensive. There was increasing pressure on the northern frontier of China from peoples in Mongolia once again, and so it was necessary to shift resources away from these very expensive voyages with limited results to a much more pressing problem, which was the northern frontier.
It was on the heels of these Chinese voyages that the European Age of Discovery began. One of the key figures in European exploration was Prince Henry the Navigator of Portugal.
You could say that Europeans are already, especially Portuguese and Castilians, are already in that world of discovery and enterprise by the late 14th century. They are venturing into the Atlantic. So that not one single individual or person can be said by himself to have ushered this world. Columbus certainly was a beneficiary of what has gone before him. But if there is one person which one could pinpoint as essentially a leader in this ushering of this new world, certainly was Henry the Navigator.
The explorations commissioned by this nobleman between 1419 and his death in 1460 inspired many of Portugal's explorers.
Prince Henry the Navigator is associated with the start of the great series of Portuguese explorations down the African coast, which eventually end up in the Indian Ocean.
And of course, the great prize in all of this is India. So to gain direct access to these markets was the great preoccupation, and it's Henry the Navigator essentially who launches this process.
Prince Henry was able to overcome the superstitious belief of his time that the southern waters were forbidden territory. He sent mariners south along the coast of Africa in an effort to find the inhabitants of these strange lands and perhaps establish trade with them. During the next 3 decades, roughly 1487 to 1522, Portuguese, English, and Spanish explorers visited much of the world. On one of these exploratory missions in 1441, a 2-vessel expedition returned to Portugal with a dozen Africans. Many saw them as no more than curiosities, but some saw them as a commodity.
The Portuguese in 1441 bring back the first consignment of African slaves who are brought to Portugal and landed and sold there. This is the beginning of the Atlantic slave trade, which will then burgeon into an enormous traffic by the 17th and 18th century.
For the next 400 years, slavery remained an important part of Portugal's economy. And when the first colonies were established in America, slaves would be among the first settlers. But apart from slavery, the exploration of the western coast of Africa was important for another reason. Europeans wanted to find a sea route to India, where there was much money to be made in the trade of silks, cotton, precious stones, and above all, spices. In the mid-1400s, it wasn't known if the African continent extended all the way to the South Pole, or if there was a southernmost tip of Africa leading to eastern waters. The man chosen by Portugal to find out was Bartholomew Diaz. He set sail in 1487 to discover if there was indeed a southernmost point of Africa.
In the initial phase, the Portuguese had been interested simply in trading with West Africa. Gradually, they get the idea that they can, following Ptolemy's scheme of geography, that you can get around the bottom of the African continent into the Indian Ocean, and then you can tap into the very, very lucrative spice trade, which goes across the Indian Ocean from what is today Indonesia to Arabia, Persia, and then into the Mediterranean. And Diaz in 1487 shows that this is possible.
Although he encountered fierce storms near South Africa that sent him off course, as he headed east back to his original course, he found open sea and decided correctly that a seaway to India did exist. Diaz returned home triumphantly in 1488. King John II of Portugal named the tip of Africa discovered by Diaz the Cape of Good Hope. Meanwhile, the Italian mariner Christopher Columbus, had presented a plan to Ferdinand and Isabella, the rulers of Spain, to reach India by sailing westward instead of east.
The Portuguese experts, navigation experts, said that Columbus's calculations about the size of the globe were inaccurate and unreliable, and he wasn't really to be trusted. They didn't have any particular reason to follow his idea of going westwards to China and the great rich realms there. They already had an idea of how to get there. So eventually he sells his idea to the Spanish crown.
It was not known at the time that the continents of North and South America existed. It was thought to be open ocean from Europe to Asia.
Which is to say that if the New World will not have been there, Columbus would have never made it to India, because those three ships could not have sailed the Atlantic and the Pacific together. So essentially it was just simply a fortuitous event that there was this unknown land in the middle that he could reach. Otherwise, we will have never heard of Columbus again.
In his 3 subsequent voyages, he continued to search for India.
Columbus conducted 4 voyages. The first voyage of exploration, 1492, the second voyage of colonization, 1493. In 1498, he leaves again on another voyage where he heads much further south, and this is the voyage that takes him to the northern coast of the continent of South America. His final voyage, he goes out ends up in 1504 exploring the western Caribbean as far as the Isthmus of Panama, ends up coming home towards Hispaniola, shipwrecked on the island of Jamaica, is eventually rescued from Jamaica, and then comes home to Spain and dies there in 1506.
Although he never found India, his discoveries were considered very important to Spain. He was justly rewarded and given the title Admiral of the Ocean Sea.
Columbus did eventually land in a new world that after him will become a very important component of the world picture, which will also bring, especially after the entering of the Spaniards or the Castilians into the Valley of Mexico, that will bring untold wealth to Europe in the form of bullion, silver and gold. So, in retrospective, he did open a whole new way for the world to develop.
With the success of Diaz and Columbus, it became clear that Portugal and Spain were the world leaders in exploration. King John II of Portugal opened negotiations with Spain's Isabella and Ferdinand to arrive at a mutually agreeable division of the spoils from their expeditions. The agreement, reached in 1494, is called the Treaty of Tordesillas. The Spanish and the Portuguese asked the Pope to help settle the dispute.
So essentially what the Pope does, although the Pope is pretty much pressured by the Spaniards, is to set up a line of demarcation. Everything east of this line belongs to Portugal, and everything west of this line belongs to the Kingdom of Castile.
At the time, South America had not yet been explored. In later years, it became clear the demarcation line cut through eastern South America, giving Portugal the opportunity to claim Brazil. England was another country that tossed its hat into the exploration ring. In 1497, John Cabot led a British expedition to North America.
John Cabot's interesting because he is obviously trying to follow in Columbus's footsteps. He sails from Bristol in western England across to the north coast of America in 1497. He knew about Columbus's voyage, and he was trying to emulate Columbus and find out and establish trade relations with another part of the American continent, which by then everybody knew was out there.
Instead of the southerly route taken by Columbus, Cabot sailed an almost due west course that put him on an island called Belle Isle. Remarkably, it was only a few miles from the spot where Leif Erikson made his settlement in the year 1000. Cabot claimed the land for England and named it the New Isle, which by 1502 became known as the Newfoundland. Today, we call it Newfoundland. The region's most attractive asset was fish, thousands of them in wild abundance, which soon attracted fishermen from England, France, and Portugal. Another of the successors to Columbus was Amerigo Vespucci, a Florentine who gave of his services to both Spain and Portugal. In 1501, in the service of Portugal, he spent 9 months exploring the eastern coast of South America, passing and naming the beautiful coastal port of Rio de Janeiro. He claimed to travel as far as latitude 50 degrees south before turning back for home. If the records of this latitude are correct, it gives Vespucci a prominent place among the explorers of South America.
And of course, his story is picked up by a German mapmaker who names this new world after him. So instead of being called Colombia, it's called America after Amerigo Vespucci. So he gains this extraordinary fame, but his accomplishments were important but minor compared to that of many other explorers.
Vasco da Gama, a gentleman of the royal household of Portugal, was chosen by the new Portuguese king Manuel I to be fleet commander and ambassador to the Eastern Kingdoms. His challenge was to break the trade monopoly held by Arab nations in the Indian Ocean. In July of 1497, with a fleet of 4 ships and 170 men, he set off for India.
Da Gama sails southwards down the Atlantic and rounds the Cape of Good Hope and sails up the eastern coast of Africa, stopping at the major ports along there. Eventually, he gets to the port of Malindi and there picks up a pilot who takes him across to southern India from Malindi. It's with his help that Da Gama makes the voyage from East Africa to India. Probably even without his help, Da Gama would have made it one way or another. But having the help of this pilot obviously accelerated things and facilitated them no end.
To Da Gama's dismay, the Indians were not eager to trade with the Portuguese.
When Da Gama reaches southern India, he's not welcomed with open arms. The local rulers are suspicious of him. The Muslim rulers there are not at all happy. And in fact, very quickly, relations between the Portuguese and the local rulers of the port cities of southern India degenerate.
The Portuguese will eventually control the Indian Ocean, again by another technical development, which is introduction of broadside artillery. They can blow you off the water. They don't have to board you. They can kill you up from afar with guns, which are now placed on board of the ship.
The King of Portugal bestowed on him the auspicious title, Lord of the Conquest, Navigation, and Commerce of India, Arabia, and Persia. Portugal wasted no time following up on Da Gama's success. 6 months later, in the summer of 1500, Pedro Cabral was named to lead an expedition comprising 1,200 men and an armada of 13 ships. Their goal was to duplicate da Gama's voyage and build a trade relationship with India. On the outward sweep into the Atlantic, the fleet ventured far enough west to reach the eastern shore of South America. Cabral promptly claimed the land, Brazil, for Portugal on the authority of the Treaty of Tordesillas.
Now, because of the way the line is drawn, when Cabral, going out on the second Portuguese voyage to India in 1500, when he sails far to the west in the Atlantic and ends up in Brazil, he lands on territory which is technically within the Portuguese sphere as laid down by the Treaty of Tordesillas. So he's able to claim it, and that means that Brazil will become Portuguese territory as opposed to Spanish.
Sailing eastward, they pressed on toward South Africa. Off the Cape of Good Hope, the fleet was battered by storms. 4 ships were lost, and among the dead was Bartholomew Diaz. Arriving in Calicut, India, Cabral was met with hostility and violence. The Muslim traders wanted nothing to do with the Europeans. Moving to the cities of Cochin and Cananor, he was able, through trade negotiations, to fill 7 ships with spices, porcelain, incense, and jewels. In June of 1501, Cabral returned to Portugal with his precious cargo. He had lost 6 of his 13 ships and half his men, but his spoils repaid the costs of the voyage. The Portuguese sent a series of expeditions into the Indian Ocean in the first decade of the 16th century to establish bases of operation. Through negotiations and force, they accomplished their goal. By 1520, Portugal dominated the seas of southern Asia. The balance of world trade shifted westward from Venice, long the center of world commerce, to Portugal. Only one achievement lay ahead for the age of discovery: the circumnavigation of the world. The task fell to another Portuguese navigator, although in the service of Spain, Ferdinand Magellan. Magellan set sail in 1519 with 5 ships and 260 crewmen.
Magellan is sent off, again, with a relatively small fleet of small ships. These were not big vessels, these were exploration vessels. And in 1520, he rounds the southern tip of South America and gets into the Pacific, and then sails across the Pacific. Eventually, they make it to the Philippines, and it is in the Philippines in 1521 that Magellan is killed in a fight between 2 local chiefs. The fleet by then has been reduced to a couple of rotten ships, and one of his junior commanders, Del Cano, who is a Basque sailor, is in fact the skipper who brings the whole expedition home.
Of the 5 ships and 260 men, only 1 ship, the Victoria, crewed by 18 men, came back. The violence in the Philippines, mutiny, scurvy, and shipwreck claimed the others.
I think that the circumnavigation of the world, which is begun by Magellan and completed by Sebastián Elcano, is a very important moment. It comes very early, so there is still a great deal of exploration to be done and places to settle and colonize, much, for the next 200 years. But it brings some kind of important statement. Here is a European who travels westward and reaches the same point from which he departed by going around the world. And it has that kind of powerful image of a world that is now essentially linked together, that is new in many respects. by someone being able to go around it completely.
Magellan's expedition achieved what Columbus had sought to do: find a sea route from Europe to Asia by sailing west. The intrepid explorers of the Age of Discovery during the late 15th and early 16th centuries did not set out to change the world, but they did. They ended the isolation of Europe. They opened trade routes around the world. They claimed new possessions for the flags of their countries and established colonies. Their voyages opened the door to hundreds of explorers who followed them.